I'm Betsy Kaplan here with Kyone Wolf asking during your podcast. I'm not sure what time you're listening to this, but we're glad you tune in. We're glad you tune in, I hope every day, but whenever you can. So give us a call, but you have to support the show. We can't do it without your support. 1-800-584-2788. Go online at WNPR.org.
And just like you made the great decision to listen to this podcast, please continue to make great decisions by being a member or renewing your membership. If you don't remember the last time you renewed your membership, then it's probably time to renew it.
That's a problem.
It's a problem, but you're going to solve it because you're a public radio listener, and that's what you do. So call 1-800-584-2788 or go to WNPR.org/donate. And
thank you.
Enjoy the podcast.
So I've been thinking a lot lately about even the philosophical underpinnings of this whole country, this whole American experiment, and it's a set of ideas that was passed forward from Immanuel Kant to Thomas Locke to John Locke to Thomas Paine. That idea that we really do know, we have the almost inner capacity to apprehend what is just and what is unjust, what's right, what's wrong. It's there in us. When you're watching a documentary about something that's obviously manifestly wrong, you can feel it kind of gnawing at you. But what we don't always know is what to do. A lot of times we just sort of stop there, that, okay, I just saw something that's wrong and it shouldn't be like that. We don't know what to do, who to call, how to act. So today we're going to talk to some people who figured out what to do. They figured it out under the worst possible circumstances imaginable, but they have managed to take those terrible circumstances and to accomplish something very important. So, and in the final segment of the show, we're going to talk in a more general way about what people do. You see it now with we were just talking before air about the Parkland kids, and now another cohort of younger people trying to do something about climate change, realizing that maybe the power does reside with ordinary people if they can act in collective and constructive ways. In the studio with me are Mike and Kristin Song. They are parents and gun control activists who spearheaded the passage of a bipartisan gun safety bill called Ethan's Law. They founded the Ethan Song Foundation. Kristin is an attorney. Mike is the CEO of GetControl.net. Maybe we should just very quickly begin by reminding people, Kristin, what Ethan's Law is. What is the law that we did pass here in Connecticut?
Ethan's Law requires that all firearms be secured if you have a minor in the home or if you have an inappropriate person in the home that should not have access to guns.
And so obviously this begins from your own story, Mike, and for people, I think most people in Connecticut know, or at least know parts of this story, but maybe we have to remind them. How did this whole thing begin for you two?
Well, Ethan had a friend, a neighbor whose home he played in, and unbeknownst to us for months, guns had been accessible to kids in that home. And it was the guns were never checked in on. These guns were produced from various places, according to police. The police shared with us. So one day, Ethan hugged his mom. He had gotten his braces off earlier that day, and Kristin had a wonderful morning with him. They had actually spent some extra time together because of the braces, and off he went. And he never came back. And he's been in 10,000 places, but in a home with an unsecured gun and a kind of a relaxed, cavalier attitude towards safe gun storage. Well, 10 minutes later, he was dead. And it's been just the tragedy of our lives. You can imagine Kristin, she tells this story, and it brings people to tears, but she was sitting there and the police officers come across the front lawn. And it's kind of like in that movie, Saving Private Ryan, where the mom just collapses. And so from that tragic moment, kind of a nightmare unfolded. If you can imagine driving to the hospital and they didn't tell us what was wrong. They said, you just have to go. And I think one of the most terrifying moments of my life was simply arriving, and there was 5 or 6 police officers there, and they knew who we were, mm-hmm. and they knew why we were there, and they knew what had happened. And my heart just completely fell. And then a few minutes later, our minds were reeling because we were sitting in a room. We had fallen off of the little bench we were on. Doctor was leaning up against the side of the room, and he just said we couldn't do anything. So at that point,
and we just I kind of assumed that when the police told me to get to the hospital that my son had either been hit by a car or broke his leg. And when they said he was killed by a gun, we just couldn't even fathom how they got access to a gun.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Ethan was 15, if we didn't already say that. And it did turn out, I guess, that he and this friend had been experimenting with this gun or had access to the gun for a while, right?
Yes, they did.
Yeah. In one account the police shared with us, it was produced from under a bed. Another incident occurred with a rifle in a front hall closet that the kids were dry trigger pulling, kind of pulling it, ha-ha. And these guns should have been locked up, and everything would have been, a $75 pin code gun safe, and our kid would be here, and the world would be a different place. But unfortunately, that's not the decision that gun owner made.
One of the things I've been thinking a lot about, this is kind of a side trip for a second, but it's worth talking about. So I was watching the series on Netflix, Unbelievable, and there's one of the two police investigators, lives with her husband, who's also in law enforcement, and you see them every time they enter the house. They put their gun in a safe, lock up the safe, hit the combination. Every time they leave, they get the gun. I thought, what? I've never seen that on television before. I've seen thousands and thousands of cops with guns and bad guys with guns. I've never seen safe gun storage ever once. And boy, that's something we probably need to make a little progress on in terms of modeling.
Yeah, I think I've had a lot of people reach out to me, and a lot of the moms who said that their child had committed suicide with their spouse's weapon from work. And so I know that people have this false sense of security that if you grow up with guns, that your children understand the power of them. But they are teenage boys. They are children. They don't think things through all the way. And that's why I've always maintained that as a parent, it is your job to protect your child from themselves.
Right. This is in my family, too. My father made a very, very serious suicide attempt when I was a teenager. He did it with a combination of alcohol and pills. But when I was 14 at the time, I was searching his car, which he had abandoned. I was reaching under the seat, and my hands did close around a gun. I brought that out with just my hands shaking, and he did wake up eventually, and he said that he had that in case it was unpleasant or painful. He was going to finish the job that way. So obviously this is all kind of sad. I'm going to play a little clip of you, Kristin, talking in this very vein to, I believe, Senator Cory Booker.
Ethan asked if he could go to his friend's house, who lived down the street from us. He walked out of our home, and he walked out of our lives. His friend's father had 3 unsecured firearms stored in a shoebox. The boys were posing with the guns and posting to social media. Unbeknownst to Ethan, one of the guns was loaded. He was shot in the head and killed, and my world shattered into a million pieces. I was suicidal, and I am so glad that I did not have access to a gun. Senator Booker, what role do you think the federal government should take in mandating safe storage practices so that our precious, beautiful children can live?
Right, so that's a painful thing to hear, but it's the story of what could have been 2 deaths instead of 1 death if you'd had the means at your lowest moment. So, Mike, we're going to talk a little about what you did in the whole arena of public policy. But as that clip illustrates, as the conversation we're having illustrates, the first thing you had to do was figure out, how do I even begin to take care of myself? How do the two of us begin to take care of ourselves? What do we do to even get to the point where maybe we could become functioning people who could go out there and make some changes? Maybe you can talk a little bit about that process of just figuring out how you heal from a wound that most people just never encounter.
Sure. Well, you feel you're on a different planet. You feel like the world that you knew is completely changed because a part of you's been sort of torn away. So, of course, one of the things we do today, we research, and it's not, if you research this, it's not a pretty picture. You see a lot of people 20 years later, it's like it happened yesterday. They say that. So I made a commitment, and Kristin and I made a commitment that we were not going to be victims, but we were going to be warriors, even more than survivors. We wanted to be warriors, and we were going to get up and fight and make positive things come out of this. And a few things that I did one day, I just said, I hadn't gotten out of bed really very much in 3 days, and a friend said, look, what can we do? Do you want to go for a run? And so my friends Dan and Keith took me for a run. And then I realized that movement helps, talking helps, exposure therapy helps, staring at my son's lacrosse stick, which brought me to my knees the first 10 days. On the 11th day, I felt like maybe I could handle looking at that lacrosse stick and just not falling apart. I have a great therapist named Lauren down in Guilford. I see her every week religiously. It's very important. And we even went into different kinds of more experimental therapies that have to do with visualization and eye movement.
It's called brain spotting, right? And it's done partly, I think, at the Sandy Hook Resiliency Center.
Yeah, and if you're suffering, it's such a good thing to know about, because I was shocked at how useful it was. It gets you to tune in and look at a certain place where your feelings just come out of you, and your pain just kind of comes out of you. And you cry, but you heal at the same time. It's profoundly, and I'm the biggest skeptic in the world. And I walked out of there saying, boy, I'd like to tell every single person that some of these newer therapies, it's not really alternative, but it's a newer therapies. It's very powerful. And the folks at Sandy Hook rated it their most effective therapy to handle their pain.
Right. And I think when you're facing that, you'll try a lot of things because...
You have to work really, really hard. You have to choose to try and get better, because it really is like moving a mountain. And Mike and I kind of had a little bit of different way of kind of healing. I went right into research and advocacy. Mm-hmm. I started researching what's the leading cause of death in children, and I found out that gun violence was the second leading cause of death. And how is that possible? And it was possible because kids had access to guns, period.
Another thing that you got to worry about in a situation like this, I mean, we know this from seeing things like Sandy Hook, is it's hard on couples, right? It's hard on a marriage, right? Mm-hmm. You guys had to figure out,
it wasn't really, I mean, it was hard on us that we lost a child, but we made a pact really early on that we were going to allow each other to grieve any way we wanted. Mm-hmm. So I went to more like, let's get something done, and Mike did a little bit more traditional with exercise and counseling and that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. And we just never judged each other on that. So I don't think we've ever
I think it's hard on couples who can't quite realize that you're going to grieve differently. You're going to have days where you're thinking, why is this such a problem? And we just kind of accepted each other and opened ourselves up to, we're going to be on a rough journey, and so let's stick together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the reason I'm asking these questions, too, is that coping, if you're going to act, if you're going to change, you're going to go out and meet with legislators, try to go through the fairly harrowing process of trying to get a law passed, you've got to be in a different place, right? You had to get well, right?
Well, it's interesting. I think a lot of parents who lose a child, you kind of like compartmental it off so that you can get some stuff done. So, Mike and I would go and we'd lobby really hard, and then we would go back to our hotel rooms and we would cry. We would break down because we were kind of holding it all together for the day. Yeah. So,
but we seem to complement each other in that I do a lot of public speaking anyway, and Chris can tell the story of Ethan in a way that just melts people. And I've seen, Senator Blumenthal and Ned Lamont, our governor, and all Rosa DeLauro, and she just starts talking, and people realize safe storage will save lives. They know it's true. And I've seen her even convince a lot of folks from the CCDL and the NRA that at the very least, we all should be locking up our guns with kids around. And I've seen her just move mountains. And I'm just excited to be by her side in this mission, because that's another thing you need to heal is a mission. You got to have something to fight for.
All right. I want to talk about that mission. I think this is a good place to take a very, very short break. We'll be back in just seconds with a Mike and Kristin song.
Hey, it's Kyone Wolf here with Betsy Kaplan, taking a second out of your podcast. I know you thought you were totally off the hook from listening to the live fundraising, but we just want to take a second to say thanks for tuning in. And also, please help us keep this coming into your podcast feed. The number to call to be a member or renew your membership is 1-800-584-2788 or WNPR.org/donate.
And you have lots of advantages listening to the show on podcast, because we're only going to speak to you for about 20 seconds, maybe 50 seconds, unlike 5 minutes. So reward us with the fact that we're speaking to you less time. We're taking less time out of your enjoyment of this great show that you're listening to. Give us some support to keep these shows going, no matter how you listen to them. 1-800-584-2788 or go online at WNPR.org.
All right, we're back with Mike and Kristin Song. We're going to move now into the story of Ethan's Law and how it came to be. And Kristin, you said that one of the things that you did sooner maybe than Mike did was begin to think about activism, begin to start to research the question. So at what point did you think, all right, this is going to be a law. We're going to change the law about gun storage?
That actually came up one day when I was talking to a prosecutor who said, the problem with the law is, you have to prove the gun is loaded, and any child that has any kind of dexterity can load a gun. Mm-hmm. And so really that was one of the big issues in why the father or the gun owner was not charged. So this now just says to everyone, you need to lock up every firearm that you have.
Right. So, but it's easy to say that that's what the law says, but it's not easy to get the law passed, although we should say this law passed by overwhelming margins. But Mike, I think in the initial discussions, you got pushback, as people tend to do in these situations. Like, how much pushback was there?
I think there was tremendous pushback because I think the number one objection is I need to get to my gun real fast, which is part of the problem. So we have guns on coffee tables and drawers and on nightstands all throughout Connecticut and all throughout the United States. We began to make videos, and you could see them on our Twitter site, Ethan's Law 2. They started to get retweeted by people like David Hogg, and that was a catalytic moment because suddenly this number one argument was being kind of debunked by showing people how you can open a PIN code safe or a biometric safe, all of which can be around $100 or less, in 2 seconds. So it really stopped people saying that. We noticed that after a certain point, they switched to their second best argument, which wasn't a very good one, which is that safes don't work and everyone can break into every safe. And I just don't think people believe that. People know that you're better off locking things up. I mean, we wouldn't have email passwords or bank accounts if that wasn't true. So I think once that was the secondary argument we heard, and boy, we heard it a lot at the hearing, right, Chris?
Yeah, we did.
They would say, oh, my 10-year-old son can open any safe in 10 seconds. And I just don't think people believe that. It's just...
Well, it's the deterrent, just like having a fence around your pool.
Yeah.
Right. Well, and I think there's also, I don't know how much of this that you got, but I think in these situations, what I've heard over decades of covering situations like this is also there's a strain in part of the American temperament that says, just because this thing happened to this other person,
yes,
why should my life have to change? Why should my freedoms be abridged? Mm-hmm. Why should, this isn't anything that I ever had anything to do with. Why is it being used as a reason to make a change I don't want? You're just saying, yes, you did run into that.
Well, yes. We had people say, bad laws follow tragedies. But I actually did the research, and 8 children a day are dying every day because they have access to guns. So suicides, accidental shootings. Some of the mass shootings were guns from their home because they were not locked out. Sandy Hook is a perfect example of that. Those guns were in a safe and they were not locked up.
Were there people who just said, well, that somehow or that's your fault or that's your son's fault or this is...
Yeah. There's quite a few people that said, all you had to do is say to Ethan, guns are dangerous. It's like we could solve the opioid epidemic by saying don't do drugs. Yeah. It's not true. And then they say, well, we should do education. And look what we've done. We've gotten 2 Disney shows on their number 1 rated kids show to portray a gun safety message. This was seen by 20, 30, 40 million people, so nobody believes in education more than Kristin and I. But we also know that if you don't have consequences, a rule has really very little meaning. And that's what this is. We're just taking the NRA rule that you should always lock up your guns so no unauthorized person can get access to them, and saying let's put some oomph into that so that there is a penalty. There is something that happens if you break that rule.
But again, we talked to gun owners and we said, we don't want to penalize you. I hope Ethan's Law is never used. I hope that the cultural shift becomes that the gun owner pauses before they leave their home and they think about where are my deadly weapons and who is going to have access to my home.
Right. And I also just want to say that anybody who said all that other stuff to you has never had a son. I have got a son. I know at which points in his life, educating him, warning him, creating narratives for him to try to help him understand would have made any difference. And really, there was just a long period where I don't think anything like that. I mean, young boys, we know their prefrontal cortexes are not well developed. They are, particularly vulnerable to bad impulses. And so that whole idea that they're going to review everything that's ever been said to them about this subject before they do something is just, that's fanciful.
Right. We would have no deaths in children from car accidents or, drug overdoses because all of us are teaching our children how to be safe, but they are independent from us. And, I was doing a keynote the other day and I asked the audience to raise their hand if they'd never engaged in risky behavior in their life. And obviously not one hand raised because we have all done stuff that was probably a little bit risky. And Ethan got unlucky and we got lucky.
So let's hear a little bit of what this sounded like, because, there was pushback that you encountered initially. This wound up being a very positive experience. But let's hear an opponent. This is State Senator Rob Sampson speaking about the bill.
Obviously, this is a very difficult issue to speak about, and even more difficult to speak out in opposition to. However, I feel compelled to do so. Being here all the way back after the tragedy in Sandy Hook gives me some perspective and reminds me that it is not a good idea to make public policy based on an emotional response to a tragedy. It is much more important that we get these things right.
So that's the argument you guys were talking about, right?
Yeah. It doesn't. If you really break that down, I think it's really the logic flow there is it was really not an emotional decision. It was a logical decision based on research, and I began to follow into the advocacy field when I got up off my back and inspired by Kristin, and we learned that it absolutely is the reason why so many of these things happen. And we began to gain momentum when people realized that it was, like Kristin said, in Parkland, that young man came into a home with a semi-automatic weapon, and the father said, "Yeah, we need a safe for that. You go buy it." So he had access. It was not safe storage if you give that disturbed young man access to a safe. So in Sandy Hook, absolutely, he came home, he grabbed the gun. It was not locked up. He went out, and we all know what happened. So, I'm very emotional about this, but I have a very clear, logical way of thinking about things and only want the best for everyone's kids. So I think that, it doesn't really hold up what he's saying.
You went into this as smart, well-informed people, but there's the old saying, you don't want to see how sausages are made. You don't want to see how laws are made for the same reason. I don't know, and once again, this might not be the best test case because, in fact, this was passed by an overwhelming margin in both chambers. People did listen to you. But I don't know, what did you learn, Kristin, about that whole process by which we do get to that point?
Well, I think both Mike and I took the position that we were just going to go in and have a conversation with them. We didn't go in and demand stuff. We weren't yelling. We didn't, we weren't crazy people. So we just kind of went in and had a conversation. And I think that allowed them to kind of let down their guard. And so, for example, at CCDL, we were at Mike was doing a panel.
We should say CCDL is the gun users, the gun owners lobbying and sort of collective organization. Anyway, go ahead. And
so we had a panel discussion, and this was really amazing because we just started having a conversation, and they saw us as just parents, and we saw them as parents, and we kind of all just came to a common ground. I'm sure they did not want the law, but they all practice safe storage.
Yeah, that was what was so fun to see. Like, I was dreading it, and they came in, and a guy named Dom Basil and I had this sort of a spirited debate. But in the end, Dom and I sit out in the parking lot and talk for half an hour about the fact we both play guitar. And we both think the same exact thing about safe storage, except that Dom feels it shouldn't be put into law, and I feel that it should. We shook hands. He was a perfect gentleman, and I can't say enough about him. So we found so many gun owners they would agree to disagree politely. They were very respectful. And many, many, many gun owners who approached us and said, we're for this because our kids play in other people's houses.
Yeah, and that was interesting when we said, would you allow your children to go over to a neighbor's house that had unsecured weapons? And they were like, no. And I said, well, how do you know? How do you know that neighbor is storing those guns properly?
First of all, I just want to second the emotions that you're saying here. I do. It was kind of, there was over the weekend kind of an interesting thing where Ellen DeGeneres was photographed sitting next to President Bush, and a lot of people were kind of critical of that. And she said in her show, you really do benefit from being with people who don't agree with you. As long as you can do it in the way that you describe, Mike. I get a lot out of talking to people who don't share my beliefs, as long as we can do it in a good way. So when you guys first got in touch with me, you were, I think, maybe about to go to Washington. So since then, you spent 3 weeks there, Kristin?
Yeah. I spent a lot of time in D.C. And again, when Mike and I met with the Republicans, I think that they were all very respectful, and I think they all agreed that safe storage is a very important thing. And I think a lot of them do want to jump on to co-sponsoring Ethan's law. I just think that things need to settle down a little bit in D.C.
Yeah, she's being modest, Colin. I mean, I got to watch her in Senator Pat Toomey's office, in Peter King's office, in Representative, I think, Crenshaw, who was the gentleman with the eye patch, that whole brouhaha where someone made fun of him for his tremendous service to the country. Brian Mast, who has lost his legs in, I think, the Iraq or Afghanistan war. We spoke with him directly. I got to tell you, Kristin, the survivor story is so powerful. And I just encourage anyone in this gun violence prevention world, always have a survivor come in and talk, and because it just stops people, makes them think. Kristin comes in and she says, we can't change what happened to Ethan, but we can change it in the future. And people start to visualize a better future. And I've seen some very, very tough guys and men and women suddenly very open to the idea of safe storage. And I'm very proud of her for what she's accomplished.
So, Kristin, in your estimation, where's that at right now federally?
It has probably 75 co-sponsors so far, and we just started. And I think, I'm very optimistic. I think it's going to pass. I think it's an easy lift. And I think, like Mike said, the first place I went was to the NRA to see what they suggest to do with your guns. And they actually have a stricter protocol than Ethan's law. So...
All right, so more to come on this, and Mike and Kristin are here for the hour, and we're going to talk also to somebody who sort of looks at this whole question of how do people make changes in a time when we feel kind of individually powerless. We feel as though there's kind of an intransigent network of people who have more power than we do, who are able to get in our way. So all of our guests are going to talk about that after this. Right now we have a short fundraising break, a pledge drive break, and yeah, I mean, we do value this kind of conversation that we're having here today, and we know that you value it too, and it's a chance to have a longer conversation about a serious topic. So yeah, if that's the kind of radio that you like, obviously a nice thing to do would be to pledge right now. Okay, before I forget, today's show, this episode was produced by our senior producer, Betsy Kaplan. Kyone Wolf is on the board, making sure everything sounds great. And tomorrow's show is The Nose. It's our weekly cultural roundtable. We're going to be talking about 2 different movies on that show, so join us. All right, so we're back with me in the studio. If you're just tuning in, are Mike and Kristin Song. They are parents. They are responsible for the creation of Ethan's Law, which is our gun safety law here in Connecticut. They are working for that kind of change now also at the federal level in Washington, D.C., maybe about 75 co-sponsors now on that bill. And so before we add a third voice to this conversation, we were talking about this off the air, about that whole idea, which we're going to talk about right now, about how powerless people feel and how they could feel more empowered. And Mike, you were saying growing up that Ralph Nader was kind of an inspiration to you. Yeah, I grew up in Trumbull, Connecticut. My mom was in the League of Women Voters, and she was big on seatbelts. And she had followed, Ralph Nader and the safety data. And so we buckled our seatbelts. And the first thing that I said, and I think when we were with Senator Blumenthal and we were announcing Ethan's Law down in Guilford, I asked everybody, did you buckle your seatbelt on the way to here? And every single person raised their hand like it was nothing, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. We think in a few years that's what safe gun storage will be. It'll be you put it in this safe, you lock it, it's a PIN code safe, it opens in a second. And guess what? It's a win-win. You get your gun, and we can't get in it if we're kids or if we're someone who has a behavioral health issue. And that'll be a good thing. So, yeah, I do think there's a history there. I feel the sweep of history moving towards just smart, sensible, common sense things.
And we're just so glad that here in Connecticut, representatives like Sean Scanlon and people like the Newtown Action Alliance helped us kind of formulate a strategy to get it through and pass it with such overwhelming, bipartisan support. That was just so meaningful to me to see my son's name on a bill that will help keep kids safe.
And Kristin, there is that sort of flip that has to happen between you can't do that, you can't impose that on me, which was a lot of people reacted to seatbelt legislation that way.
Yeah,
and don't
my
make
mom
me do
did.
that. Yeah, my mother did too. My mother would not wear a seatbelt.
Yeah, my mom, it took a couple of years before my mother actually started wearing a seatbelt. And my kids actually cannot fathom how we were just loose in her car and we would roll out the sleeping bags. And that's kind of how we hope the safe storage for guns is, that the exception is seeing a gun outside of a safe versus having guns lying around your house.
Right. So Ralph Nader, who is a native of Winsted, Connecticut, and is still up there in Winsted a lot of times, like last Saturday, doing stuff about this, is a great example of what our next guest is about to talk about. Eric Liu, co-founder and CEO of Citizen University. He's the author of several books, including You're More Powerful Than You Think, A Citizen's Guide to Making Change Happen, and most recently, Become America, Civic Sermons on Love, Responsibility, and Democracy. So Eric Liu, welcome. Thanks for joining this conversation.
Thank you so much for having me, and just really honored to be in the company that we're in here in this conversation.
So one of the things you talk to people about in your TED Talks and stuff like that, and in your books, is kind of maybe breaking the question apart. Because if I just sit here, I have a radio show and I feel powerless a lot of the time, but let's say I'm just an ordinary person and I'm sitting there and I want to make the kind of change, maybe the kinds of change that the songs did make. I sort of feel like I can't do that. The hill is too steep. There's too many obstacles on it. There's well-paid lobbyists who are going to oppose me. There's, I'll just never get there. So how do you break the problem apart or the question apart so you can feel that you have a little bit more human agency?
Well, I think almost everything I heard Kristin and Mike's song saying there is a classic case study of how you do that. In the first place, it's recognizing that every one of us, even in the most terrible, rigged, lopsided situations, has the capacity to generate brand new power out of thin air through the magic act of organizing. When you actually invite 1, 2, 5, 3, 10, 100 other people to engage you in some common endeavor, the way the songs did after their family tragedy, you change the frame of the possible. I think that's the first and most important thing, that when you think about this work as being just you in isolation, maybe you in isolation, disconnected from everybody else, can feel rather powerless. But when you actually connect with any other human on a common endeavor that requires common goals, common strategy, organizing, and the practice of coming together to make common plans, you generate power where it did not previously exist. Now then, you get to the next step, and you talk about breaking this down, which is you got to be able to read the map of power on an issue like gun safety and gun violence reduction. You have to ask the question, well, who decides? Right? That is the central question of all civic power. Who decides? And the songs understood that, well, this is not a thing that my mayor could do. This is not a thing that Congress immediately was going to be the first arena for fixing. But the state legislature can and should do this. And the legislature is movable. And the legislature is not some vast blob. There are individuals there, including 1 or 2 or 3 who represent you. And if you get that relationship built there, you start catalyzing a different kind of conversation and a different kind of change within that body that has the power of decision. But the thing that really struck me about what Kristin and Mike were saying, the seatbelt analogy. Yes, today it is the case that you can be fined under law if you're not wearing your seatbelt. But the reason why so many people now just do it as a matter of course, the reason why it's unthinkable for the current generation that you wouldn't buckle your seatbelts, is not really because cops are waiting at the corner to see whether or not you've done it. It's not really because cameras are watching us. It's because it became a social norm. Mm-hmm. And the power to actually shift social norms and to change the sense of what's okay, what's normal, is a power that every one of us has, especially, again, when we organize with others to change the frame, to change the conversation, and to change the story. Again, I think this case study that this living case study that we've just heard with Ethan's law and this incredible legacy that the songs have created for people, in the state of Connecticut, is a testament to that. And I think, in our work at Citizen University, we really try fundamentally to remind people that, look, if you say that I'm powerless and there's nothing I can do to make any change happen, that may or may not be objectively true, but saying it almost certainly makes it true. Preemptively surrendering whatever agency or clout you might have, your ability to organize people, to mobilize money, to get legislators and politicians to pay attention, again, to change the frame of the normal and the acceptable. When you surrender that and see that preemptively, then sure, yeah, you guarantee that you're going to be the object of other people's power rather than the agent of change. But when you flip that around the way the songs did, all kinds of other things are possible in civic life. And I think this is true across a whole range of issues. It's not just guns. And I think we live in a time right now where everyday citizens, and I don't mean people with documentation status and passports, everyday members of the community who see themselves as part of the solving of problems in their community are proving it in communities across the country on issues that run a wide gamut, that people can actually exercise and practice power where they didn't think they had any before.
Kristin makes a lot of really interesting points that apply to your situation. One of the things that I often do tell people is that they don't know how much power they have. That I used to work at a radio station that was really different from this radio station and had a lot of viewpoints aired on it. Well, I used to follow Rush Limbaugh. That'll give you kind of a sense. And people would ask me, well, what am I going to do about this radio station? and I would say, if they get 100 phone calls, that's like a really scary day. If they get 100 phone calls, this is a big radio station. It's owned by CBS. Doesn't matter. If they get 100 phone calls about one thing, that's a really frightening day for them. And I think people don't understand that, how much power they have to affect big institutions, whether it's government or private business.
It's very true. And I think we found that out when we especially went down to D.C. And Mike and I always had the objective that we are Americans first, and then we're Democrats and Republicans. And so we really wanted to just build like a community, because we do believe that that's the way that we're going to get some stuff done in the United States.
Mm-hmm. But Mike, there is this. I mean, look, probably before you guys went to D.C., you heard or read or were told by, however many people, the NRA has this place wired. They've got these members of Congress completely on a leash. So what's your response to that?
I think it's just an illusion. I think these are houses of cards, and if we work together, we can really bring a lot of people across. And there's so many gun owners who are in favor of background checks or don't want to see someone who's a danger to the neighborhood have a gun. These gun owners are great people. The NRA is not as powerful as they're perceived to be. There's a lot of perception in politics. And what Kristin and I realized was that they started coming up to us at the very first event. We were in Bridgeport. I still remember it very clearly. Gentleman walked up. Hey, I have a gun in my house. I store it really safely. I have a certain kind of safe in my car that's like impossible to pull out of the car. I have a 10-year-old child, and he plays next door. And I went next door, and I saw a gun on the counter. And I asked the guy, hey, could you lock up your guns? And the guy chased him out of his house. Mm-hmm. And so that told me that this guy was on our side, even though he was a gun owner, probably a member of the NRA. People can be reasoned with, and I think you have to try. And sometimes you have these amazing conversions of folks, and it's possible to happen. It is possible, and it's a great time to feel empowered and to go out and to try. And a group that really helped us, I think, in this quest was the Moms Demand Action, Moms and Connecticut Against Violence. They wear red and orange shirts, and they would show up at these events. And my just confidence level would soar because we were all there together pushing for something great. And I just can't tell you how much the working together, that organizing that Eric was talking about, absolutely. We experienced it. It was almost a magical thing that would happen.
So, Eric, Lou, one of the things people do, I think, is because it's a little bit seductive these days, is they think, oh, yeah, I retweeted that. I was pretty upset about that. So I retweeted that. And I'm not going to buy that kind of pillowcase anymore because, I don't agree with their values. I think one of the things that I'm hearing from the songs is like you have to physically be somewhere figuring out, as you say, Eric, where the power is and how you influence that power.
Yeah, I mean, there are times where, digital media and technologies and social media are a useful part of the repertoire, but there is no substitute for face-to-face. There's no substitute for meeting people where they are, not only to create pressure on them in the presence of the orange shirts that Mike is talking about there, But again, on the other side of the way that they're talking about, to look someone in the eye and realize, on paper or on social media, someone's profile may say NRA member, gun owner, and you may assume that you can put them in a certain box. But when you look them in the eye, you tell a story, you share a story, you understand where they're coming from, you realize someone is movable or changeable in a different way. You realize there's another way in to their heart or their head. And doing that face-to-face is the most powerful way to actually build a sense not only of organizing power, but frankly, of keeping our muscles toned for how to govern ourselves in a democracy. We don't govern ourselves at a distance. We don't govern ourselves in a mediated way. You all are in Connecticut. I mean, you still have enough of a New England tradition of town meeting in that sense of town-by-town ownership. This is not just something you subcontract out to people who you see only on screens. And I want to tell you, too, just as a kind of a story of the feedback loop of inspiration and motivation. After Sandy Hook happened, a friend and a colleague of mine here in Washington State, where I live, I'm in Seattle. At the time, we both had kids who were pretty young, and we were so shaken both by that massacre and by the seeming paralysis of Congress in the wake of that massacre. And we decided we needed to do something where we live. We couldn't necessarily get Congress to act in that moment, but we certainly knew enough people and had a sense of how to make change happen in Washington State. And so the very next morning after Sandy Hook, we called a breakfast meeting. And at that breakfast meeting were a handful of activists, faith leaders, educators, just concerned parents and neighbors. And out of that breakfast meeting emerged an organization that would come to be called the Alliance for Gun Responsibility. And that alliance emerged organically out of not only the catalyst of that crisis, but out of this sense of invitation. You have no idea how ready people are to show up, to flex some muscle, to engage and find their voice until you invite them. Yeah. And when we invited them, people began to show up in incredible numbers. And we then, over the course of the next year, within a year, actually passed a statewide ballot measure by vote of the people of the state to institute universal background checks. And since then, we've had 2 or 3 other successful statewide ballot measures in Washington for extreme risk protection orders and the like. And I want to just highlight one thing about that story, not only that it's happening in a contagious way and that, we are inspired by people like the songs, and maybe now this story will inspire others, that the song's example certainly will inspire others to action. But the other thing I want to emphasize is the name of this organization. Mm-hmm. We called it the Alliance for Gun Responsibility.
That is an important point. Eric, we're pretty much out of time right now. And before we leave and lose this moment, I do also want to mention the Ethan Miller Song Foundation. Speaking of names of things, we didn't get to that. It's involved in other things besides gun safety: animal rescue, human trafficking, special needs, distracted driving, substance abuse, veterans issues. So check that out on your search engine, the Ethan Miller Song Foundation. Thank you, Mike and Kristin Song.
Thanks, Colin.
And thanks, Eric. And thank you.